Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Hallie Franks. I am an associate professor of ancient studies at the Gallatin School at New York University, and it is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker in our Emerging Scholars presentation series. This series is organized and hosted by NYU's Center for Ancient Studies, and I'd like to thank Matthew Santarocco and Mara Pollard for their support of this program. The Emerging Scholars series showcases the research of current PhD students, and we are particularly excited to engage approaches to the study of the ancient world that incorporate non-traditional materials and/or methods. In this video, we will hear from, and I will speak with, Konstantin Karakanasis. Konstantin was born and raised in Thessaloniki, Greece. His love for ancient Greek started in middle school when he became fascinated by the ability to figure out the etymology of modern Greek. Right? And his love of classics started in high school, where he was dazzled, as many are, by Thucydides' history and Sophocles' Antigone, both, of course, part of the national curriculum there. Despite parental disapproval, he chose to study philology at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, where he majored in classics. After graduating, he moved to the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, from which he earned an MLit in Greek and Latin, with a thesis on the religious perspective of the parados in Aeschylus's Agamemnon. He's now pursuing his PhD at Washington University in St. Louis, where he's finishing his dissertation very shortly, I think, and we'll hear more about that today. Despite his clear love of drama, Konstantin is equally interested in the material aspects of antiquity, and his research interests lie at the crossroads of literary art and the socio-political, as well as the economic environment within which those were created. In other words, he's interested in the ways that society, its norms, and institutions influence literary production and vice versa. Given his love for things on and in the ground, he has spent the last 2 years at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, learning how to appreciate the intricate and multifaceted nature of our field. Today, he will talk about Enter Homo economicus, civic motivation and civic education in Aristophanic comedy. Konstantin.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. Well, I'm very glad that NYU and the Center for Ancient Studies is hosting this series, and I'm given the opportunity to present my research. So for my dissertation, I attempt to reevaluate the function of Aristophanic comedy within the institutional context of Athenian democracy. Old comedy was a distinctively political genre of theater in which prominent personalities of the day were ridiculed by name and various political phenomena satirized with zest. Despite its blatantly political nature, however, the relationship between Aristophanic comedy and contemporary politics has been a subject of vigorous debate amongst classicists. For some, Aristophanes' work had a politically neutral outlook. Its main goal was to make audiences laugh, and its political references were only incidental. For others, Aristophanic comedy was politically partisan, but this group of scholars is split in two camps. On the one hand, those who claim that Aristophanes had a conservative agenda that opposed radical democracy, and on the other hand, those who claim that he was fond of the democracy and that his political commentary meant to offer advice towards improvement of the status quo. In keeping with the latter school of thought, my thesis is that comic theater, at least as conceived by Aristophanes, was offering lessons in proper civic behavior within Athens' direct democracy. What prompts me to read Aristophanic comedy through this lens is its commentary on Athenian public finance, especially with regard to external incentives and their behavioral effects in the civic sphere of activity. Here, let me elaborate. Incentives are interventions with an aim to influence behavior by altering the cost of a targeted activity, thus either prompting or dissuading people from engaging in said activity. Such interventions can be either positive or negative, meaning either rewards or fines. Now, one of the liveliest debates in social science nowadays concerns the use of incentives for the design of public policy. The bone of contention being the degree to which they can effectively encourage desired civic behaviors. My argument is that this debate also informs the writing of Aristophanes, in whose comedies the use and effects of incentives were consistently problematized. Given that the knights will be serving as our case study and is my chapter 1, the incentive I'm referring to is primarily the drastikon, court pay, which was introduced somewhere around the mid-5th century and given to citizens who volunteered as judges in law courts. The latest research in behavioral economics suggests that within a civic context, the implementation of monetary incentives introduces market-oriented behaviors with adverse effects. Similarly, Aristophanes directly connects court pay to civically corrosive phenomena. Next to criticizing the effects of incentives, however, our playwright also provides advice to his Athenian audience on how to avert further socio-political damage. Accordingly, next to an edifying criticism of the status quo, my analysis suggests that Aristophanic comedy also aimed at civic education. Before we focus on Aristophanes, let us first look into the field of economics, which has produced one of the most enduring analytical models of human motivation, namely the Homo economicus. The economic man is a rational actor actuated by self-interest towards maximizing material profit. For early theorists, the motivational abstraction of the Homo economicus was a deliberate simplification applicable for the sake of heuristics strictly within the realm of wealth production. Nevertheless, the economist's model would eventually come to cross epistemological barriers as it provided an actor of a conveniently calculable predictability. In other words, when a rational actor is faced with a decision situation, the option offering the highest prospect for profit would be the expected choice. In view of that, in a highly influential study on motivation, Gary Becker would come to argue that all human behavior can be viewed as involving participants who maximize their utility from a stable set of preferences. From that point on, the human propensity for self-interest became axiomatic, so the use of positive and negative incentives was elevated to a prerequisite for the effective design of public policy. A good case in point is the implementation of incentives as a measure towards promoting widespread vaccination against COVID-19. From free barbecue, beer, cars, lottery tickets, and cash, positive incentives, either material or monetary, were implemented as a matter of course. Yet the effectiveness of those wanting people to get vaccinated proved inadequate in all cases, and for some, these results were not at all surprising. Already in the late 70s, social psychologists were able to analyze and measure empirically how positive external motivation, like a reward, reduces or crowds out an individual's intrinsic motivation to act, thus developing the so-called crowding theory. Experiments revealed that external interventions crowd out intrinsic motivation if the individuals affected perceive them to be controlling. For economists working on social policy, crowding theory raised the stakes for the modeling of human motivation in non-economic settings, given that in their point of view, people's prosocial behavior depends on the relative cost which incentives help defray. During the 90s, Bruno Frey assembled empirical evidence which demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that incentives indeed diminish other forms of motivation. So the use of a price system to regulate civic behavior eventually came under serious scrutiny. In a contribution to the modeling of civic behavior, Elinor Ostrom examined our observed willingness to undertake costs for the sake of achieving collective outcomes next to the factors affecting our motivation. The result was a challenge to the widely accepted need of incentives for policy design among social scientists, as Ostrom demonstrated that external motivation endorses self-interest, promotes collective inaction, and eventually crowds out all those values connected to citizenship in a society of democratic institutions. A decade later, Michael Sandel exposed the social damage caused by the extension of a market-oriented thinking into almost all aspects of modern life. As a result, the literature on incentives started emphasizing the fact that their crowding out effect on other forms of motivation was most harmful in civic settings. But what are those other forms of motivation? The subdisciplines of behavioral and experimental economics have demonstrated demonstrated that our so-called social preferences like altruism and reciprocity are fundamental motivational factors for our actions in both economic and non-economic settings. After surveying the results of 50 experiments both in the field and in laboratory settings, Samuel Bowles and Sandra Polanyi Reyes argued that incentives do indeed out social preferences. In these experiments, given that human behavior is sensitive to the framework of a decision situation, the most important cause for the crowding out phenomenon appeared to be the situational cues provided by incentives for the appropriate behavior. Interestingly, when monetary incentives cued a profit-maximizing mentality as appropriate, their targets exhibited what Bowles and Polanyi Reyes termed moral disengagement from the targeted activity. Regarding then people's civic behavior and contribution to public goods, a disproportionate appeal to the homo economicus within us has proven to drive away prosocial attitudes from the members of any given society. Succinctly put, in the case of COVID vaccines, incentives can make our communities less altruistic. One then might ask, when exposed to monetary incentives, would people's social preferences in pre-modern societies be equally susceptible to crowding out? Let us see what Aristophanic comedy has to say on the matter. Produced in 424, the Knights presents the struggle for the stewardship of an Athenian household between a sausage seller and a Paphlagonian slave. The plot is simple. Two slaves open the stage, protesting that the newly bought slave from Paphlagonia harasses and gets the best of the rest of them, since he has figured out how to manipulate their owner, Demos from the Deme of Pnyx, a bad-tempered old man. An oracle reveals that Paphlagon will be undone by a sausage seller, and while the two slaves are reading the oracle, once the sausage seller obviously happens to pass by. Excited with the prospect of Paphlagon's downfall, the two slaves attempt to acquaint the sausage seller with his destiny, but he is afraid of the whole undertaking until a chorus of knights, our play's namesake, promises to aid him. From that point on, the struggle for Demos's stewardship unfolds in a series of 3 comic agones, during which the two contestants vie to prove who loves Demos the most. Eventually, the sausage seller not only emerges triumphant over Paphlagon, but also miraculously restores Demos to his former youth and glory. Obviously, the play is a political allegory. Old Demos stands for his namesake, the citizens of Athens, and his slaves for politicians who pledge themselves to the service of Athenian citizens. Thus, the struggle for Demos's stewardship is a struggle for political prominence. The Paphlagonian slave has been considered a transparent persona of Cleon. On that account, the Knights has been read traditionally as a demagogue comedy, poking at the politically based leadership of the most prominent demagogue of the day. Recently, however, Robin Osborne has argued that the politics of an Aristophanic play lie in the themes that it explores. The main political theme Osborne identified for the Knights is the relationship between political advisors and the corporate body in receipt of advice. Certainly, this relationship is at the forefront of the Knights, but one cannot help but notice that the most persistently explored aspect of this theme is the way political payments factor into this relationship. In view of that, by juxtaposing Paphlagon with Cleon, analysis of the play focuses on food imagery and its connection to court pay. As we shall see, in an attempt to satisfy his appetite for money, Demos resorts to tactics that demean the political life of Athens and enable the vitiation of the rule of law. In this regard, the portrayal of Demos and his profit-seeking mentality raises a red flag for contemporary civic behavior, suggesting that social preferences in the Athenian body politic have been severely affected. Nevertheless, the play is not confined to a pessimistic criticism. By extolling the altruism that informed the civic behavior of citizens during the previous generation, Aristophanes presents the sausage seller and his altruistic civic mindedness as the remedy to what seems to be an ever-declining democratic culture. Let us then start with some food imagery. As declared in the prologue, after figuring out old Demos's ways, Paphlagon secured his stewardship by using flattery, foodstuff, and appropriation of other slaves' services. Although shrouded in metaphor, the foodstuff used for whittling Demos is unmistakable in its connection to judiciary proceedings. Even though explicit reference to court pay is made only twice, allusive references to state payments in the form of food metaphors pervade the play. Before looking at some of the significance of those passages, however, some historical contextualization is necessary. The way Paphlagon's actions approximate those imputed to Cleon in our ancient sources seem to render the character a focalized token of the so-called new style of politics. To defeat Paphlagon, the sausage seller must excel in blustering and flattering, but Cleon was ideally cast for the role of Paphlagon, not only due to the spectacle of his idiosyncratic oratory, but also due to his manipulation of the courts. As analyzed by Edward Harris during the Peloponnesian War, the novel practice of using the courts to eliminate one's political rivals vitiated the rule of law, and Cleon was the most accomplished practitioner of the new tactics. Given the grotesquely litigious attitude of Paphlagon in the play, it seems that the Knights bears testimony to Cleon's practices in real life. As a result, Aristophanes had an ideal focalizer through which a developing phenomenon of Athenian politics could be scrutinized. But one should not assume that a manipulation of the courts was due to litigative savvy alone. The stress of the Peloponnesian War on Athenian finances exercised certain pressure on courts to convict wealthy men and to collect large fines in order to secure adequate public funds that would translate in court pay later. This phenomenon is attested in Lysias later in the century, but the Knights also speaks to this situation later in the play when the sausage seller and the magically rejuvenated Demos go over the latter's new attitudes. To the question as to what will happen to a prosecutor who intimidates judges into convicting by stressing the prospective lack of pay, Demos responds that henceforth, contrary to how things transpired in the past, the said prosecutor shall be put to death. The corruption then of the democratic judiciary system during the Peloponnesian War is depicted as a bilateral operation of self-interested parties, since everyday citizens, in a spirit of abuse of court pay, aided and abetted the manipulation of courts by self-serving politicians. Criticism towards this bilateral abuse is equally traced when Paphlagon is attacked by the chorus of knights and cries for help from the judges in the audience. Despite its brevity, this metadramatic plea has a great deal of implications for Paphlagon Cleon and his relationship with the judges. The claim to be feeding the old man manning judge panels alludes to the excessive prosecutions Cleon brought to court, since convictions generated revenue for the state and hence guaranteed public payments. Indeed, Cleon was the one to pass a motion raising the rate of court pay from 2 to 3 obols per day sometime around 426 BCE. The most important thing to notice here, however, is how the old judges are said to belong to a phratry whose founding quote-unquote hero is a mock personification of court pay. Therefore, if Cleon organized certain citizens in a group of political support for the sake of subsidies, it appears that court pay did more than incentivize participation in the administration of justice. Let us pause here and ask, is it at all legitimate to claim that certain Athenian citizens engaged in a crucial aspect of democratic life, such as court service, out of pure economic self-interest? In the Knights, the motives ascribed to judges aiding and abetting politicians like Cleon suggest a resoundingly positive answer. As a matter of fact, the economic self-interest of citizens is not hidden within allusions. Rather, as you can see on the slide, it is unequivocally expressed by Demos himself. The gullibility that had Demos seem like the vulnerable victim is revealed to be a tool in the hands of a victimizer. And in this twist of self-knowledge, the self-interested calculation of profit maximization is presented as the beating heart of a corrupt civic culture. Certainly, the rule of law was one of the most important cultural values in Athens. Nevertheless, if court service was a contribution necessary for democratic citizens to enjoy the public good of the rule of law, then the issues identified by social scientists in the use of monetary incentives to stimulate pro-social behavior seem to be illuminating for the dramatized situation. If Athenians started condemning wealthy fellow citizens and supporting self-interested prosecutors for the sake of guaranteeing adequate state funds to be dispersed, then it appears that the motivational factors associated with the desire for the rule of law were crowded out, and court pay facilitated the process. After all, as demonstrated by social scientists, within any decision situation, a move from no incentive to a positive incentive can dramatically change the framing of the interaction, shifting an individual's decision frame from social to monetary. Aristophanes' criticism against this crowding out phenomenon and its degenerative effect on Athenian political life culminates with the use of Themistocles and his legacy as a paradigm. Themistocles himself was remembered for his admonition in 483 BCE to invest the windfall from the Larian mines in building 200 triremes, which proved to be the salvation of Athens during the Persian invasion of 480 BCE. After becoming the new steward, the sausage seller rejuvenates old Demos and gives him a hard lesson by pointing out past mistakes. As we saw earlier, one of those mistakes had to do with the abuse of juridical power to guarantee adequate funds for court pay. In the same vein, the sausage seller points out that in the past, when faced with a decision situation of investing or disbursing public funds, Demos would choose the latter. This dilemma of public finance clearly evokes the naval policy of Themistocles, but no such dilemma would or did ever present itself in the last third of the 5th century, given Athens' navy-based strategies during the Peloponnesian War. The passage thus makes no pretense to castigating a current political malpractice. Instead, this reference to the shipbuilding debate back in 483 functions on a symbolic level, offering a model of the past on how deliberation on public goods should work in the present. Consequently, Aristophanes seems to be preoccupied with the narrowing of the concept of utility entertained by Athenians in comparison to their past, extolling the era of Themistocles as an example of a time when utility was conceived in communal rather than individual terms. Although the Knights presents Athenian politics in a bad light, given Demos's rejuvenation at the end, Aristophanes drops the curtain on an optimistic note. The sausage seller magically rejuvenates old Demos, not only offering relief from Paphlagos' insidiousness, but also readjusting Demos's entire political outlook. This turn of events has been considered by some scholars an inconsistency of the plot. Yet, despite his obnoxious credentials, the magic that the sausage seller performs on Demos is not out of character. Instead, it is the miraculous result following from an equally miraculous manifestation of altruistic civic mindedness. During the third agon, the sausage seller plainly demonstrates that his aspiration to stewardship is informed by altruism rather than self-interest. Contrary to Paphlagon, who serves Demos only the scraps of what he withholds in his basket for himself, the sausage seller serves everything from his own basket. This altruistic motivation is not a total surprise. On entering the stage, the sausage seller is immediately accosted by the two slave politicians trying to make him join their cause, but he remains hesitant about his ability to become a steward of the people. In an attempt to convince him otherwise, one of the slave politicians recites the oracle portending Paphlagon's demise, the last line of which reads, and I translate, "The god grants great glory to the sausage sellers unless they prefer to sell their wares." The slave politician obviously misses the operative word here, which is no other than unless. In other words, the current status quo will never come to a halt unless the rank and file decide to pursue an active participation in politics. By the end of the play, then, a political layman has taken a bold step into the arena of politics and has done so for the benefit of the Athenian citizens collectively. In conclusion, the Knights presents Athenian politics as a comic yet brutal game in which self-interested players alternate in the roles of victimizer and victimized. In this game, incentives not only have become tools in the hands of self-serving politicians, but also have diminished the Athenians' sense of civic duty. Still, the play is far from a cry of despair. Extolling the altruism exhibited by the sausage seller, the closing scene projects the pro-social mentality characterizing the Themistoclean era as a remedy for the corrosion affected by the adoption of a narrowly self-interested civic behavior. The Knights is thus both critical and educational. On the one hand, the play scrutinizes how a political culture reliant on a price system can cause civic virtues to degenerate into individualism and petty profit-seeking. On the other hand, the curtain is dropped with an advocacy for a return to past civic virtues, especially those exhibited by Athenians who fought in the Persian Wars way before core values of their democratic culture started getting crowded out. Thank you.
So fascinating, and it's so fascinating to see the the very immediate sort of parallels of of thinking about these connections and these structures. And the other sort of immediate parallel that I always wonder about in the contemporary context, and it seems like it's worth asking of Aristophanes too, is why is it comedy in particular, right, where these critiques seem to come through? Or is it Aristophanes in particular? Is he a particularly sort of critically or politically minded comic? So what is the genre of comedy, and why is that?
Okay. That is the big debate in terms of classical scholarship and the political outlook. Unfortunately, old comedy is deplorably fragmentary. So we do know that politics was very a vibrant aspect of every playwright in old comedy, but to what extent we're not sure. And there have been arguments that Aristophanes is pretty much somebody that does a special kind of old comedy. Also, we have all those arguments in his parodoi that, I give you great advice, and sometimes he complains that you don't listen to me or you don't give me the first prize. But why old comedy? I tend to I'm very, very positive towards scholars who argue that drama had an institutional function in democracy. And considering that there was no public education in democratic Athens funded by the state, I think that both tragedy and comedy, as well as all the choral competitions, were supplementing exactly that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that leads to to another question, which is, are you seeing sort of critiques of this particular phenomenon, whether of contemporary democracy or of the crowding out phenomenon specifically elsewhere, right? In other words, is Aristophanes the lone voice, at least, that survives, or do you have a sense that he's participating in a I guess you're implying sort of that there is a kind of educational critique that's happening, or an educational discourse of critique. So is there, right, are there other places where the crowding out phenomenon in particular is taken on?
What I try to address, and this is a big part of my introduction, because I address this debate on the political outlook. The conservatism of Aristophanes has also been considered on the basis that we see this criticism of how state payments or subsidies for political activities are creating a noxious culture. And at the same time, though, this criticism are always negative. So we have the so-called old oligarch, the pseudo-Xenophontian Athenian constitution, that says that in the courts, ever since people started getting paid, they don't care about justice, but they care about their own interest. And then you have Aristotle in his Politics that says, every demagogue, in order to come to power after Pericles, they just increased public payments all the time to garner support. Then we have Plato that has Socrates say, ever since Pericles started paying Athenians, they started becoming idle and talkative and cowardly and avaricious. But I really do like this passage in Plato, because when Socrates says that, he's talking, it's in his Gorgias. This guy named Callicles retorts, "Oh, you hear those by the men with the battered ears." So we have a distinction that this is an elitist criticism towards the democratic status quo. So we can either assume that Aristophanes is aligned with this kind of criticism, as some scholars have, or we can look at what the play is driving at in terms of political payments and subsidies, and see that Aristophanes never says we should ban public payments. I mean, some people needed those payments to be able to fulfill their duties. But what he raises a red flag over the be careful on how you start thinking about this duty. Is duty first and foremost, and you should not do it for the payment. So this is the educational aspect.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I suppose the other question that I have is that it does seem, and you've, just pointed at this in terms of, right, this sort of tension between self-interest and economic need, right? So, it seems that Aristophanes, to some extent, and certainly the Plato that you just mentioned, is thinking about this as a kind of civic and social problem, right, of participation, and not so much thinking about it as an issue of economic equity, right, which I think many people might be inclined to frame, right, these these payments today. So I'm wondering, is there a case to be made, right? Maybe Aristophanes is not making it explicitly, but is this also part of the conversation in the ancient context?
I mean, this is fascinating because right now I'm writing my chapter on the Assembly Women, which is presents a sort of proto-communist manifesto, which has been considered to be outstanding for its time, and people are looking into its interaction with Plato's Republic because he proposes the same thing of, abolishing private property pretty much. I think that everyone was aware that people needed financial assistance to be able to fulfill democratic duties. And obviously, it depends on how you look at the Athenian democracy, either from a top-down or bottom-up perspective. But obviously, yes, you had politicians like Cleon, as far as we can tell, that took advantage of that. He knew that people needed money. Here's money, give me political support. At the same time, you had people that said, poor people don't have any clue on how to run the state, so why pay them and give them the option to do that? And this is what we see at 411 with the oligarchic coup. The first thing that the oligarchs do is to say nobody's getting paid from the state anymore. So obviously, the oligarchic perspective is you cut out the financial resources so people cannot fulfill their political duties in a system that would be democratic. So I think that Aristophanes is aware of that, and that's why, as I said, he never says we should be done with these subsidies. He never suggests in his plays that we should stop paying people, because he understands that people need it, and even that the regular crafty Joe is his protagonist most of the time. He sees how that works.
So that, I mean, you've pointed in this direction towards my final question here, but could you talk just a little bit more about what you see as the big stakes of this project?
So when I came up with the idea, I wrote 2 master's theses on tragedy and Aeschylus, and I always liked how Aeschylus is you could see all these political nuances of how a playwright of the time is writing within a democracy that is consolidating itself. So I was always interested in the intersection of literature with politics. But then this idea was dropped by my supervisor, Professor Timur. He goes, "Why don't you deal with the most political genre of them all?" And I go, you know what? That sounds like a good idea. So I sat down and I read the entirety of Aristophanes. And one thing that I noticed immediately is that money is everywhere. Money in Aristophanic comedy is in every 100 verses, you will see some reference, either implicit or explicit, to some financial aspect of people's lives, or in the general view of the state, the city-state of Athens. And then I was looking at these criticisms against incentives and how the judges are always old, so they're a needy group of people, that they have become really absorbed in their own self-interest. And I go, wait a minute, I think I've read something similar. And I happened to have read then a book by Michael Sandel, and I go, wait a minute, there might be a connection here. So I think that the stakes of my project, which I find daunting, but I guess that's the magical part of it, is that for classical studies, it is a new assessment on the political outlook of theater. And also for social science, because experiments can only take place within a specific span of time. This pretty much is offering a historical case study of how we as human species interact with money as a unit that can be translated into anything, and how we react when this infiltrates our civic organizations. So I think it offers insights in two different fields. I hope so. So that's what I see as the stakes of this project.
Well, it's totally fascinating, and as you have made clear, it bears on us, very intimately. I think as big as politics seem these days, we're feeling the repercussions of them. So thank you so much. This was absolutely a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.